Hi everyone. A few people contacted me this week with confusion about their week 3 assignments. Rest assured, I'm looking into all of them and I should have answers by the middle of the week. So for your writing assignment this week, again, please remember double-spaced regular margins, 12-point Times New Roman type. As always, please just read the directions carefully. You can't go wrong if you read the directions. So this week we're reading chapter 18, which covers roughly the same chronological period as chapter 17, but with a different focus. This week the focus is religion. So there are 3 religions that receive emphasis, you'll notice, in the chapter, and those are Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. The reason they're grouped together is that they were all religions that proselytized, meaning that their practitioners made sustained efforts on one hand to gain new members, and on the other hand to enforce orthodoxy on their existing members. Now, as you'll see when you read the chapter, the more successful the first project is, the more difficult the second one tends to be. Now, if this were History 121 and not History 122, I might be tempted to point out to you that all 3 of these religions, again, that's Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam, began in about 500-year intervals from each other, with Buddhism appearing in India around 500 BC and quickly spreading throughout Asia, Christianity appearing in the Middle East during the 1st century CE and spreading throughout Europe and northern Africa, and finally Islam appearing in the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century CE and spreading throughout the Middle East, Persia, and eventually into Africa and throughout much of Asia. Now, I might also point out, if this were History 121, that these were new kinds of religions. They were religions of a different type. Some scholars refer to them as universal religions, meaning that they were in theory open to anyone. Not only was it considered possible for anyone, regardless of where and to whom they were born, to be a member, but it was considered desirable for them to do so. In addition to being universal, all 3 religions, again, were missionary religions. They proselytized. They sought new members. These, and still do to this day in many cases, these qualities distinguish them from practically every religion we know of that had existed prior to 2,500 years ago. Those religions were tribal, in the sense that your religious identity was determined by your birth. Religious identity was an extension, in other words, of clan identity in this world. Belonging to them was not a matter of choice. This used to be all religions, prior to Buddhism, really, and Zoroastrianism, which I'll talk about in a second, but nowadays there are very few. Judaism would be an example of a tribal religion that survives to this day. Now, there were also quite a few universal religions beginning in this age of universal religions that began roughly, in the same period, and perhaps even before in some cases, but that didn't survive or barely survive. So Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, these are all universal religions that are still with us to this day, but there are many that aren't. Zoroastrianism would be one example, and Manichaeism would be another. But Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism still exercised, even though they sort of went away for the most part, they still exercised tremendous influence over Islam and Christianity, respectively. So Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity weren't just different in their appeal. They were also different in what they expected of their followers. Previous religions were interested in what people did. These were new religions that were interested in what people did, but also in what they thought. They were interested in what was going on inside your head. In the old days, for example, when the Romans conquered a group of people, they wouldn't destroy their temples. They'd just take a big statue of whoever the Roman emperor was at the time, and they'd stick it on the altar in the temple, right? And you, as a conquered person, a new subject of the Roman Empire, you would be expected to pay some sort of formal fealty to it, probably in the form of a donation of food, wine, coin, whatever. Now, you might think that the Roman emperor is a big jerk, and when you walk out of the temple, you might even say that the Roman emperor is a big jerk, but as long as you paid your little tribute and kneeled or bowed when you were supposed to, the Romans didn't really care. But these new religions we're describing went a step further. They were interested in what went on in your head. They were religions of conscience. Now, before we go any further, an advisory. When we look at religions as historians, obviously, it's naive to imagine that all of the religious figures we encounter were totally on the up and up, totally believed everything they said, and were motivated purely by the desire to spread their beliefs. But it is equally naive to imagine that they were all totally corrupt and cynical and used religion solely as a means to acquire wealth and influence. Okay? So, like all large, complex human institutions, religions encompass a whole range of human behaviors, including both ones that we tend to like and ones that we tend not to like. Okay? And for examples of both, you need look no further than the Catholic missionaries in the New World that you've been reading about, some of whom were complicit in the mass murder of native peoples who had converted to Christianity and then were caught practicing older rituals, older religious practices, but others of whom stood up at great personal risk between the Mexican peasantry and colonial authorities who wished to enslave them and quite literally work them to death in the silver mines, right? So you'll see good and bad pretty much everywhere you look. So with all that in mind, now let's go back a bit and let's look at how Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam initially spread, right? All three made huge territorial expansions initially, often through warfare, and then settled into longer periods of slowly losing and gaining territory, usually to each other, and usually via trade. It's kind of like when you play Risk. You get to put a whole lot of pieces on different territories at the beginning of the game, and then it moves much more slowly after that. So we've established, or we will establish, that trade and religion were linked. This shouldn't be a surprise. Remember, the old world prior to 1500 was an extremely stationary place. Most people lived their entire lives at most a few miles from where they were born. The only people who really traveled much were merchants. Now, the main vessel for trade in the old world before 1500 was what we call the Silk Road, the thousands of mile long passageway connecting China and the Middle East and Persia and Europe. As a result, by the time Islam came around, these little towns along the Silk Road were probably the most cosmopolitan places in the world. Places where you could hear all different sorts of languages spoken and see all different sorts of styles of clothing, dress, ways of doing things, etc. These people in these hypothetical Silk Road trade towns would all have some sort of tribal or clan identity back where they came from that explained who they were and gave them a code for how to treat others and how to expect to be treated in turn. But it wasn't necessarily going to do them any good as they sat in, say, a tea house in Kashgar trying to arrange a shipment of Malaysian tin ingots to Baghdad with a Uyghur tribesman who barely speaks your language, etc. You get the idea. So how do these two hypothetical people, these two hypothetical Silk Road merchants, understand each other? How do they trust each other? If you and this other hypothetical trader both happen to be, say, Muslims, then you have something to go on. Not necessarily because you maybe share the same ideas about how the universe came into existence or what happens to you after you die, but because you're both, in some sense, bound by Islamic law. You get the idea? And it works the same way for the other religions as well. Again, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam. Traders on the Silk Road who adopted one of these identities had distinct advantages, and all three religions, as a result, spread along the old world trade routes accordingly. In a nutshell, by the Middle Ages, universal religions were important because they provided people with non-clan or place-based identities that made them intelligible to people beyond their backyards. And this ebb and flow was pretty much it for a while. The kingdoms of Western Europe and the Islamic empires of the Middle East and North Africa fought each other to a standstill in Palestine. Buddhism and Islam more or less peacefully abutted each other in Central Asia, and along the Silk Road they mixed quietly together. But you'll remember from a few weeks ago, and this is really a key theme in the course, the arrival of Europeans in the Americas radically disrupted the balance of old world trade. So it makes sense that it would do the same thing with old world religion. And it did. The 16th, 17th, and even 18th centuries were centuries of profound religious upheaval in the old world. As with trade, Western Europe was the main beneficiary of this upheaval, but it came at a cost. Just as the Americas gave Christianity the single biggest geographical expansion it had experienced since Constantine adopted it as the official religion of the Roman Empire, it was also handed the Protestant Reformation, the biggest schism it had experienced more or less in its entire history. So you got that. Just to be clear, the Roman Catholic Church experienced its biggest victory and its biggest defeat at practically the same time. On one hand, being the expansion into the Americas, the evangelical expansion into the Americas, and on the other hand, the Protestant Reformation, the breaking apart of the authority of the Catholic Church in Europe. So the question is, were the two connected? And if they were connected, how? And that's something to think about as you read chapter 18. Thanks.